give me a quick thumbs up real fast, or a wave, or a smile even. That would be great. Good to see everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Happy Friday Eve, everyone. Friday Eve it is. And on behalf of the Riverbend Growth Association, we would like to welcome you to our 5th of continued community conversations on diversity and inclusion for the year. My name is Trish Holmes, and as always, the RBGA is excited to host today's program. Just a few housekeeping notes. This event is being recorded and can be found on our website by the end of the week at rbga.org. Please note that you will be muted during this program to cut back on sound distractions. But it's 2 events. Our presenter today, our facilitator, will be at key moments asking and inviting those that would like to share to come unmute. So just know where that unmute button is. If you are using your video, please feel free to display your name and organization on your screen for networking opportunities. And as always, the RBJ is here for you and would love to hear from you via chat box today in the event you have any sort of technical issues or problems. We would like to first start this program off by thanking our sponsor of today's event, Alton Memorial Hospital. Alton Memorial Hospital has been serving the Riverbend communities as a healthcare leader for 84 years. The hospital is also a member of the BJC Healthcare, one of the largest nonprofit healthcare organizations in the United States, focused on delivering services to residents primarily in the greater St. Louis, Southern Illinois, and mid-Missouri regions. The labs of Alton Memorial's 2 convenient care locations in Jaqui and Bethalto are now available for pre-procedural COVID-19 testing to better serve our community. Hours at both locations are 8 a.m. to 7:30 p.m., 7 days a week. The Godfrey location is at 5520 Godfrey Road, and Bethalto location is at 163 East Bethalto Drive. Patients need to be present 72 hours before their scheduled procedure, preferably no later than 36 hours, and they need to quarantine after collection. We are also excited to welcome Dr. Kelly Curry to the Alton Memorial Hospital medical staff with Alton Plastic and Reconstructive Surgery, located in Suite 101 of Medical Office Building A on the Alton Memorial Hospital campus. This doctor specializes in hand procedures such as carpal tunnel syndrome. For more information or to schedule an appointment, please call 618-433-6006. Now, we would like to take a moment to thank you for being here with us today and tuning in and zooming in to listen, learn, and share. With these ongoing monthly events, the Riverbend Growth Association hopes to continue being an advocate, branding our community together as we get a better understanding of history, the importance of always looking at work, policy, and law, and creating a safe place for us all to ask questions with zero judgment. One goal, as stated in all of our other events, is to increase organizational health and community awareness or wellness. I am proud to say that this is our 12th event, so let's begin. With us today, we are honored to have back with us Ms. Jaqui Milton, who is an experienced group facilitator and curriculum developer with a demonstrated history of working in the hospital and healthcare and education industries. She is skilled in nonprofit organizations, conflict resolution, fundraising, leadership, research, community building, and event organizing. She is a strong community and social services professional with a master's of business administration and bachelor's of secondary education. A doctor of education, focuses in educational leadership and social justice, is in progress. Welcome and thank you for being back here with us today for the 3rd time. We are excited and honored to have you back, Ms. Jaqui. The floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, my friend, and I really appreciate you all for inviting me back. And it's always a pleasure being in community with you. So really quick question, can you all see my screen okay? Okay, awesome. Thank you. So really quick check-in. Feel free to leverage the chat as a way to check in. I just want to know how people are showing up in this space. I don't know if anyone's asked you how you're doing today. I want you to keep it real. Feel free to leverage the chat as a way to do that. How are you today? How are you showing up in this space? How's your day been? Right? I want to know. And I also want to honor that we have a limited amount of time. So please check in the chat and let me hear from you. So to kind of dive in, I just want to offer a debrief in case, a month is a long time. We haven't been together in a month. So I just want to offer a really quick debrief as to what we talked about the last time we were together. The last time we were together, we had an opportunity to explore origins of community, and we kicked off the conversation offering up our own definitions of community, and we took the time out to explore ways that communities have historically been created and shaped. We then took a deeper dive into the strategic role that racial segregation by way of de jure and de facto segregation have played a role in geographically separating communities according to race. And so just to offer a quick recap, de jure segregation is legislation that was passed that legally separated folks according to race from the 1880s to the mid 1960s, right? And an example of this is Jim Crow laws. De facto segregation is segregation that's come as a product of practice, right? So custom, right, is what we're used to. Circumstance, we really don't have a choice to move outside of where we are, or choice, it's what we choose to do. And so we then touched upon some pivotal legislation, excuse my pups in the back. We then touched upon some pivotal legislation like the New Deal that specifically came to shape housing segregation or separation as we presently know it in the United States. And so that also made way for practices like redlining, right? Where we had folks who were hired by the government who went in and took maps and drew red lines around communities where folks of color lived. And they told banks and the government that they should not offer loans to folks living in those areas or for properties that existed in those areas. And so we had an opportunity to look at a map that demonstrated how that looked specifically in the St. Louis region. And then we also had an opportunity to talk about exclusionary zoning, ways that as folks accrued or got loans from the federal government post-World War II, they were able to move out and create new communities. And oftentimes these were racially homogenous communities. And exclusionary zoning was a way to make sure that housing, right, like multifamily housing that would bring in folks who needed more affordable housing and subsequent resources were kind of kept out of those spaces. And that kept many communities of color and poor folks away from home ownership and resource access, while also exposing them to extreme health hazards. And so specifically, we talked about environmental injustice and the disproportionate impact that living in low-income neighborhoods has on the health of our communities. And even more, we reviewed St. Louis statistics as it relates to disparities that relate to, that have to do with lead exposure, asthma, mold, pollution, energy access, food access, illegal trash dumping, and vacant properties, where communities of color, both in our region and across the nation, tend to be concentrated. And so then we concluded our time together processing the physical and psychological impacts of separation on all of us. And we used this quote as a catalyst to kind of spur some really fruitful conversation that we ended on. And so I'll give us a moment to read this quote. And for those of us who may or may not be able to see it on our screens, I'll just quickly read it aloud. People who do not know one another because of the physical and psychological separation imposed by segregation never have the opportunity to gain from the knowledge, experience, and perhaps most importantly, the connections of others. And this has very real world consequences, as economists estimate that a substantial portion of jobs are obtained through social contacts. and that unemployment and dropping out of the labor market can be predicted by the racial composition of our social networks. So in other words, those in higher status positions who are predominantly white are likely to pass on information about job opportunities only to those within their networks, routinely excluding low income and individuals from many groups. So as we kind of pair this reality, right, with the fact that there have been ways that we have been separated along racial lines throughout history, it makes absolute sense that when it comes to the topic of economic stability, similar to residential opportunity and resource access, job access is also, and network access is also unequally distributed. And so before I move forward and launch us into the conversation that we'll be having today, because we will be taking a slightly deeper dive into this conversation by exploring ways that education and community context play a role in our experiences and in our overall health outcomes. I want to hold space for anyone who has any other reflections or questions or thoughts that they've had since the last time we were together. Or any questions about the introduction I gave. I'm not sure who's here. There are some very familiar names on this list, but I also honor that we may have some folks in the space who didn't have an opportunity to attend the past two sessions and who may have questions. So I want to hold space for that as well. And I appreciate those of you who've taken the time out to check in the chat. Dr. Jen, what you eating over there? what you filling your tummy with? I want to know. Feel free to share in the chat. I didn't mean to call you out. And so if you have any reflections, fries and chicken covered in cheese, don't you do that to us. Matthew got emos. Look, I need an in-person meeting. Y'all eating all the goods over there. Awesome, awesome. Thank y'all for checking in. Thank you for letting me pick on you a little bit. And so oftentimes, excuse me, oftentimes when I show this quote, I do so within the context of discussing trends around economic opportunity in St. Louis. And so while I may be alluding to St. Louis in many of the regards throughout the rest of this conversation, what I offer is that while there are some things that are unique to St. Louis, there are also ways that the themes we'll touch upon can be woven throughout our region, our nation, internationally even. And so what I encourage is for us to bring in that lived experience and wisdom from the unique communities that we are a part of and that we touch, to help flesh out ways that this isn't just a St. Louis thing. Please don't leave me hanging. And so with that being said, what you'll find in St. Louis is that many communities that are currently comprised of predominantly African-American residents were once heavily concentrated with employment opportunities. For example, when we look at places like the Ville, quick show of hands, has anyone ever heard of the Ville before? Let's scroll down, let's see. Anyone ever heard? Okay, not many of us. Okay, so I'm gonna send a resource list after this, because I feel like just even as members of the Midwest community, we should know at least a little bit about the history of the Ville. And the Ville was the former home to Homer G. Phillips Hospital, which was actually the only hospital for African-American practitioners and patients, mostly from 1937 until 1979 in St. Louis. And it also housed a manufacturing plant that was owned by one of the first Black woman millionaires Does anybody know what her name is? Anybody know what her name is? Annie Malone. Absolutely. So Annie Malone. So yay, I'm excited to send these resources to y'all. And so there were also communities like the Mark Twain neighborhood that exist in the 63120 zip code. And it was a community that once housed a World War II ammunitions plant that employed over 35,000 workers. It also housed a GM plant, a General Motors plant, as well as a campus of federal buildings that spanned close to 100 acres. And so leading up to the 1960s, right up until that point, there weren't many employment opportunities, right? Because there was still this operation of de facto segregation that kept a lot of African Americans out of the opportunities that were available at the time. And so after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, what we found was that African Americans started seeking better housing and employment opportunities in these areas that had governmental affiliations or identified as industries that under the Civil Rights Act of 1964 were required to start integrating into their hiring practices. However, a trend that we start to see in the 1970s and 80s is this retreat or closure of larger businesses in these areas, right? As well as the closure of some smaller ones. And so many of these wealthier businesses started to relocate to these more affluent suburbs that were created as a result of urban sprawl, where folks who were receiving the loans through privilege afforded through acts like the New Deal and ways that passed down generationally, right? They started moving further and further outside of the city core. And as a result, they incurred more taxes and thus were able to offer more tax incentives. And so, of course, businesses fled the city, right, in search of the benefits that existed in these suburban areas. And so as a result of this flight, many African Americans found themselves unemployed, right? Because we talk about the flight of families from these areas, but businesses also left. And so then many African Americans who were left in these communities found themselves unemployed with very minimal resources outside of that was provided through governmental supplements, right? They didn't really have much outside of that to call upon. And so that's kind of where I want to open up the conversation for today, right? When we think about the quote that we opened up with, that talked about the ways that networks, as a result of this physical and psychological separation, have also been unequally distributed, right? When we think in terms of employment, I just have a quick question. How many of us have ever gotten a job, or at least introduced to a job? Has that ever happened because of who is in your social network, who you know? Quick show of hands. You can raise it on screen or you can raise it using the little emoji. I see some head nods. I see a couple hand raises. Thank you. So really quickly, I want to honor that we have a question in the chat. Do you think that the process of deindustrialization and outsourcing of manufacturing played a part in St. Louis as well? Absolutely. Absolutely, Matthew. One of the things that I was researching said that the demand for some of the industrial plants and facilities that existed in these communities also started to wane and minimize, right? So the need for the ammunitions plant, for example, over time went away. And so then that brings in this broader question, right, about how skilled are the laborers, right, to meet the demands of employment opportunities that actually exist, right? And so that kind of opens up this, I'm glad you asked that question. Thank you for that. Does McDonald's count as a teenager? Absolutely. Any job, no limitations. Thank you, Dr. Jen. And so I'm going to open this up a little bit. I'd be curious to know, when you think about the people that popped into your head when I asked about your social network, how do you know them? How did you meet them? Feel free to come off mute and share with me or leverage the chat as a way to share. How do you know the people that are in your social network? John shared professional organizations. Matthew shared school and work. Thank you. Sports, school, work, development classes. Parent and church connections, the Navy, on this pretty big about the people that you went to school with. Yep, thank you, Matthew, for offering that. International travel, so experiences that we have an opportunity to embark upon. Thank you, John. Amy shared through friends. Thank you. The businesses that I use. Awesome. Thank you all for sharing. So feel free to continue to share if you haven't had an opportunity to do so. But one of the things that stands out most to me is that school or access to class or some form of education has touched or has been a direct impact on the people that have been woven throughout our social networks. And so I just want to hear from folks, like, what role has schooling and education played in where you are today? I'm gonna need some people to come off mute and talk to me on this one. What role has education played in where you are today? We've already touched briefly upon the social networks it's helped to build, but also the quality of education.
That's a interesting question. It opened up doors into communities that I otherwise would not have known about.
Thank you. And so when you think about that, are you thinking about like a specific time in your education? This is just out of pure curiosity. Like, was it, your collegiate experience? Was it, earlier on? Just out of curiosity.
It was during the doctoral level that it opened up doors into, the Greek lettered communities and leadership communities and.
I think for me, I didn't mean to cut you off, Dr. Jen.
Thank you, Dr. Jen.
I think for me, it started way back in high school. Just the connections and being involved in different sports and activities in school and maintaining friendships. Well, I say maintaining friendships, but learning how to have friendships. And then once I entered into college, at the college level, it began to open my eyes up outside of my community because I made friends with people who didn't live in my community or in my area. And from that, I was able to see a different way of what life was like outside of the Alton area from which I am from. But in obtaining my job that I currently have in education, I do believe the friendships that I made through high school, because a lot of people that I've met in high school do work in the school district, also has helped me to get to where I am, as well as my ability to make friends with other people and just be able to have general conversation with people has caused me to be able to get into the place where I'm at.
Thank you so much for sharing, Amy. I saw we had a response in the chat. John shared how to navigate within a process and interact with other people, right? And I think that echoes what Amy's saying, right? Having exposure to different people, different places, right, has offered also a diversity in how we're able to engage with different people in different places. And that tends to open doors. So thank you all for indulging me in answering that question. And so what I'm about to show, because what I want to offer is that the final half of this session today, just in full transparency, will touch on the Ferguson uprising. And so for those who are a little less familiar, the death of Michael Brown Jr. at the hands of a Ferguson police officer led to an international, recognition of racism in America, right? But oftentimes what we know most about, oh, I'm sorry, please excuse my dogs. Hold on one moment. Sorry. And so what what is oftentimes less spoken about is what was going on in Ferguson leading up to that, right? And how actually the death of Michael Brown Jr. Was the match that lit a tinderbox that had been brewing for decades, right? Not only in the Ferguson community, but also similar communities who experienced an interlocking of the social determinants of health in the way that they did. So we're actually going to kind of take a deeper dive into that, right? And that's going to start with a conversation about schooling and education. And so for those who are less familiar, this is an image of Michael Brown Jr. in Normandy High School was where he attended. And what I'm going to show is a really quick video that resonated with me that actually ties directly to his schooling experience. Let me actually stop sharing real quick because I'm scared that I didn't share my sound. So I'm going to share this really quick. Okay. Can you all still see the, okay, awesome. And so what I want to honor that for me, whenever I see this 30-second clip, it does bring tears to my eyes. I want to honor that if we're not in a space to kind of, I don't know, feel the emotion of this video because it can be considered heavy to some, that you take this 30 seconds to kind of take care of yourself. But I'm going to show this really brief clip.
Now a family is demanding answers.
You took my son away from me. You know how hard it was for me to get him to stay in school and graduate? You know how many black men graduate? Not many. Because you bring them down to this type of level where they feel like I don't got nothing to live for anyway. They're going to try to take me out anyway.
The crowd became more angered, even someone firing shots.
Hey, get back, man. Go ahead, get back.
No one was hurt. Meanwhile, Brown's body.
And so what stood out to me most in this clip and why I decided to integrate it into our conversation around education is that even in the midst, and I remember sitting on my couch, I was pregnant with my son when this was on the news. And one of the things that stood out to me as an educator in a high school at the time was that even in the midst of grieving the death of her oldest child, who at the time of this interview was laying lifeless just a few feet away from her, she couldn't help but cling to how hard it was for him to make it to graduation. And so on August 1st, 2014, just 8 days prior to being killed, Mike Brown Jr. was one of 5 Black students who graduated in a summer ceremony at Normandy High School. And this ceremony was held a few months after the main graduation, and it was specifically for students who may have been short of credits at the end of the school year and couldn't participate in the formal graduation, or who just opted to not participate in the earlier graduation. And so the Normandy School District from which Brown graduated is actually among the poorest and most segregated in Missouri, and it ranks last in overall academic performance. And its rating on an annual state assessment was so dismal that by the time Brown graduated, the district had lost its accreditation. And so a mere 5 miles down the road from Normandy is the wealthy county seat where a grand jury decided not to indict the officer who killed Brown. And success there looks drastically different. The Clayton public schools are predominantly white with almost no poverty to speak of. And the district is regularly ranked within the top 10% of schools in the state. And more than 96% of the students from Clayton graduate, and about 84% of those graduates head on to four-year universities. In Normandy, as it relates to the context provided by Ms. McSpadden, about half of the Black male students at Normandy High School graduate, and just 1 in 4 graduates are accepted into and enter a four-year college. And so some may or may not be familiar with why there is such a vast disparity in educational opportunity that can be directly attributed to the history of race in our country. And of course, as we've discussed, when we talk about businesses moving out in a community where public schools, where services like public schools are funded by tax dollars, divestment in the community also results in a divestment in education. However, a long history of practices and policies have directly impacted the educational outcomes within the communities that we're a part of and serve. And so we're gonna watch video about that. We're gonna have a couple of guests come in real quick and talk to us a little bit about how educational policy has shaped the current reality that we see today.
This school year, non-white children made up more than half of the country's public school students, but the country's schools have grown only more segregated since 1988. The most recent data shows the average white student goes to a school that's more than 70% white, and less than a quarter of Black students go to majority white schools. Jeffrey Brown takes a look at whatever happened to integration.
One metropolitan area where schools are largely segregated is St. Louis, and 1 year after the shooting death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, it's an issue that continues to resonate there and beyond. New York Times Magazine writer Nicole Hannah-Jones has reported on the situation in Ferguson and elsewhere in the country. Her work has appeared in ProPublica and on the radio program This American Life. Also joining us is Cheryl Cashin, a law professor at Georgetown University, who writes on desegregation efforts. Her latest book is titled Place, Not Race. And welcome to both of you. Nicole Hannah-Jones, let me start with you. Give us a quick overview of what you saw in Ferguson and its schools. What struck you most forcefully there?
Well, the thing that strikes you most is this is one of the most segregated, impoverished districts in the entire state. There are 520 districts in Missouri, and this district ranked dead last. It was stripped of its accreditation, and in the classrooms, sometimes there's very minimal amount of teaching occurring.
And there was even a short-lived effort, I gather, there to bring some of the students from that school district to another suburb, which was mostly white.
Yes, it was because of the Missouri transfer law. I call it accidental integration because the law was never intended as an integration statute, but because Normandy is almost entirely Black and lost its accreditation, it under the law was given the right to send its students to a accredited district, and in this case, the accredited districts are mostly heavily white.
Cheryl Cashin, it is more, not less common that American schools are segregated, are more segregated these days.
Right. In the 70s and 80s, many school districts around the country were under court orders to desegregate. And in the 90s, the Supreme Court basically signaled it was time for courts to stop policing desegregation. And 2/3 of the school districts that had been under desegregation orders have come out from under them. And we've had a rapid, massive resegregation since 1988.
And have we largely given up on the idea of integration?
Well, I hope that's not true. There are about 80 school districts in this country that voluntarily have school integration plans. They tend to use economic integration as their model rather than race because the Supreme Court makes it hard. But those 80 school districts are out there trying without a lot of encouragement, frankly, from the federal government or others. So I hope because they're successful places like Louisville, like Montgomery County, Maryland, increasingly people are looking to the Hartford example, where 45 magnet schools that are well-resourced and integrated have been built because of a lawsuit. And There's a multiracial coalition of parents, the chef movement, that supports it. So there are positive examples out there. I hope we haven't given up on it.
Nicole Hannah-Jones, what did your reporting tell you about the state of attempts at integration, and what are the key factors in it?
Well, what it tells you is that integration efforts in this country peaked in 1988, and that's also when the closure of the achievement gap peaked. So since then, we've seen largely an unraveling. Cheryl talks about that there are 80 school districts that are actively attempting integration, but there are thousands of school districts in this country, and most of them are not. As a nation, we've kind of decided that desegregation efforts are not politically worth our while. And so you have seen a pretty rapid resegregation, particularly in the South, and in much of the Northeast, there was never much desegregation in the first place.
And what are the biggest factors in all of this as to who's getting a better education? Is it money? Is it teachers? What is it that makes the difference? What do we know?
Well, there's two things. Now we're seeing in Black and Latino schools a high concentration of poverty, which provides a very difficult learning environment and teaching environment. But also, data collected by the U.S. Department of Education shows that to this day we have failed to make separate equal. So schools that are heavily Black and Latino get the least qualified teachers, they get the least rigorous curriculum, their facilities are worse. And so the separation is continuing to harm these students.
What would you add to that, Cheryl Cash?
Well, Nicole is right. I don't want to misrepresent the facts. 80 districts pursue integration, 14,000 don't. And Nicole is right. The vast majority of Black and Latino students in public schools today are in separate, unequal schools. And the United States of America does the opposite of what its competitors, who are beating us in international test scores, do. Our competitors put the most experienced teachers in disadvantaged areas. We do the opposite. We tend to put, the weakest, often uncertified teachers in schools with the most need. And only 1% of high poverty schools succeed. And unfortunately, the Department of Education has focused its efforts mainly on trying to turn around high poverty schools with not much success. And hasn't focused much on deconcentrating poverty, which is proven to be successful when it is achieved.
All right.
So that was about 6 minutes of just, back-to-back information. And so I'd like to just hold a little space for folks to share. Was there anything in that stood out to you? And, as you share, I'd also encourage you to think about, first and foremost, your own personal experience with education, right? And what that's brought up for you, but also think about the respective communities that you serve and live in, right? And in what ways did what we hear, how does that stand up against what we know or have experienced in the communities that we're currently working to build?
Okay, if no one else is going to speak, I think I will. So being that I work in education, and it struck a lot of emotion in me from watching the first video with the Michael Brown situation to watching the video of the PBS news report with the two ladies speaking. And what really strikes for me is looking at it in a situation to where our school district here in our community with Alton, we have, sorry guys, we have the makeup in our district right now. We're probably sitting close to about 38% African American or Blacks in our school district, to about 62% that are white. Our ratio of our teachers in our district is 92% white females, mid-class. And I think when it comes to funding, I believe that is very much so true the case in that area where the Black schools are poverty schools. They don't get the money, they don't get the best teachers, and it should not be, because there needs to be an intentional focus. And I feel like the intentional focus is not in educating them, it's in educating to the middle class or the average student or above. When you want a school district to excel, you have to put resources and intentionality where you're not being successful at. And I think that's what's striking out to me the most from that.
Thank you so much for sharing, Amy. Dr. Jen wrote in the chat, I have strong opinions on how American education is failing the future with a lack of innovation, diversity, creativity, and honest history.
Yes.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with Amy too. The push of funding towards specific schools is very much, it's obvious. Like, I don't even know how people refuse to see it. Because it is very obvious. And in America, teaching is not necessarily a priority career position, which is also a failure. Teachers certainly need paid a lot more for what they deal with, because teachers today are teachers and parents and counselors and everything up above, not just teachers anymore. And that's, that's been my experience with for several years. And my youngest one is 15 and in high school. And even through her years, I saw how much the teachers had to deal with all of the issues. And in another school district, they went to the downtown school, which was not like taxed well, I guess would be it, because it was downtown. So it wasn't given a priority, or it wasn't even given equal opportunity really, compared to other areas where they had like prestigious titles, prestigious names. And it was really interesting, considering that the school that they went to was considered one of the top international, I can't even think of what they're called, international schools. Because the teachers, even though that area lacked that funding, they pushed more because they cared more about their students. And I gotta say, the diversity of this school was phenomenal. And they had international students coming to this one school. The other schools didn't even participate in this. This was the only school that did. And the kids that went to this particular high school, I felt that they had a better understanding of community, of diversity, of an international relation among cultures. And it was very noticeable in majority white districts, the lack of understanding.
I'd like to build on what Dr. Jen said.
Yes.
I think, you can talk about funding all day long, and the funding really doesn't matter. And until the community puts value on education, you're never going to see a difference. You can throw money at it all day long. It's not going to matter.
Hey, John, I would agree with you, but also I would say until the community puts value in all students, and when I say all students, I'm talking about students of color, until they put value there, you're going to continue to see that. You're going to continue
Absolutely.
to see what is happening. So once again, it has to be an intentionality that is placed upon the kids, the community.
I have to leave it.
So we as in a community, we're definitely going to have to put a different focus or a different light. Therefore, when you have districts like the Clayton district, I believe is one that was spoken of, there's an intentionality placed upon there. There's a high expectation that these kids are going to be successful and do well, because not just because of the money, but because of the intentionality. That same intentionality has to be placed in community where there's poverty, where there's race issues. Those things have to be looked at. Otherwise, nothing is going to change. We're still going to stay in the same state of mindset, and we're going to increase the amount of resegregation that's going to happen.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you for bringing, thank you, John, for bringing your thought into the space. And thank you, Amy, for that as well. And so I just want to honor what's said in the chat, although I do believe what Amy said leads wonderfully into the response, right? Because, so I'm going to read what's in the chat and then I'm going to say this next thought. So Melissa shares, I made a note to myself to sit with and consider the term resegregation. I had not heard that term before, and the initial consideration of it for me is unsettling. For sure. I'll also take note of that, Melissa. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for honoring that dissonance in this space, right? That means a lot. And so as I kind of prep some material for folks to read after today that I'll send to Trish within the next day or so, I'll be sure to include maybe some resources about that topic as well. Matthew said too much money goes to politicians parading as teachers and not actual teachers. Good teachers are fleeing because the system is unsustainable and highly politicized. Thank you for offering that thought into this space as well, Matthew. And so once Normandy lost its accreditation, many parents within the district sought to relocate their children to accredited, more resourced and affluent districts. And so I'm just going to show 30 seconds of a clip that captured the response of parents from one of the districts that parents were trying to send their students to. And I think that it weaves wonderfully with what Amy was saying, right? About how, yeah, we can throw money at it, but also, right, there's an entire paradigm shift that has to happen around equity in education and who has the resources and how we even view the right of everyone to have access to those resources. So I'm just going to show 30 seconds of this clip.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Sharon Reed. I am live right here outside the Francis Howe High School. This was the spot of an emotional meeting last night. That meeting stemmed from a Supreme Court ruling that allows for unaccredited students to transfer out of their unaccredited schools, and some of them will be going right here to Francis Howe High School. The number we have just learned is growing. Applications now at 400. So as we said, this is an emotional time here, and that is dividing this community.
I deserve to not have to worry about my children getting stabbed or taking a drug or getting robbed, because that's the issue.
I am totally appalled that we have now gone back to 1954.
We don't want this here in Francis Hall.
I grew up with this. I'm not going to have it for my son. So if this district send my son to a better school when this one goes down.
Don't judge my girls, my daughters, because of what these other kids go through. I don't want my kids in the school district.
And so I'm going to pause. What did you all hear, see, and feel after watching this clip?
I heard fear based around bias.
Yeah.
Yes. Bingo.
Yeah. Thank you. Christy shared sad and appalled, right? And so what we see here, right, is a couple of different nuances, right? We have this issue around how public education tends to be funded and the disparities that exist there. There's also a disparity in how we, on that psychological and physical separation from one another, and the ways that it's shaped how we view one another, or communities that we're less familiar with, right? How we've been conditioned to see one another. John shared, losing accreditation does not happen overnight. Why doesn't any community react to prevent it? What I will offer is that, so I'm going to also add some additional information around this. And I think that's a really good question, John. There was a lot of advocacy, and there's been consistent advocacy and reform that's been happening in the Normandy School District. But what happened, in short, is that while the Normandy School District was struggling with its accreditation issues, actually, no, I'm going to send some information because I do want to honor that we only have 5 minutes left. But I will make sure to reach out and plug you in with just kind of a fuller scope of what happened around that. So thank you for asking that. I think it's a very important question. And so when we look at Ferguson, so let me rewind a little bit. So it's also important to recognize then, right, when we think about a lot of times how Mike Brown Jr. is automatically associated with the Ferguson uprising, when we think a little deeper about the true tragedy in his death, it's not limited to his individual potential brutally cut short, right? It also speaks or reveals a more subtle, ongoing racial injustice that many students still experience today. And that's the vast disparity in resources and expectations for Black children in America's stubbornly segregated and educational school system. And so I really hate we can't dig deeper into that, because I would like for folks to just process even beyond today, ways that our unique educational experiences have kind of been informed by these outside factors, and also ways that they're at large or at play in the communities that we're serving and working in. And so there is another video that I did want to show, but instead I'll also add it to the list of resources that you all can kind of continue to delve into as you're able and would like to. But it talks a little more broadly about ways that employment disparity, right, played a role in Ferguson. Housing disparities. It also touches on even the relationship that communities had with law enforcement agencies, right? What I'll honor living in Ferguson for some time, or in North County in general, is that you can drive down a single city, like a single stretch of street, and hit about 6 different municipalities on the way. And so when we think about the number of municipal warrants that exist for folks of color who live in these municipalities, let's say I have a broken tail light, I could get 6 different tickets going down this stretch, have to attend 6 different court dates, or pay 6 different set of fees, you know what I'm saying? And so even when we think about the relationships we have with public services and servants, right? All of that plays a significant role in what it means or feels like to be a citizen in that place. Have the rights of every citizen in that place should have. And so as you move forward in this work, I'm going to take us back really quickly. Oh, I thought I added it. Sorry, let me go back real quick. I just want to take us back quickly to the words that make up the mission of Riverbend Growth Association, right? And the vision that you all have for your community. For the first, for the past few sessions, we've had an opportunity to just kind of weave through ways that social determinants of health have touched different spaces and places in our region. But I think at the end of the day, to make it relevant, it should all come back to ways that you are fulfilling the goal of RBGA, to provide leadership, right? To promote and support new and existing enterprise growth, to improve the quality of life and employment opportunities, right? We're going to have an education, impact on the educational programming that's rolled out in your community. And the focus is on the health of your communities. And so given all the things that we've learned in this space over the past few months, I encourage you, not to go in saying I have the answer, but to instead reframe the paradigm, expand it, right? And seek to learn more about ways that social determinants of health have been shaped through practice and policy in the regions and communities that you're serving and beyond, because it's touching all of us. Let me be real. All right. So with that being said, thank you, Melissa. I really appreciate the community and the engagement and the transparency and the conversation that's gone forth today. And if I can ever be of assistance in helping you further process this journey, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know. And I'll make sure Trish to send some follow-up information and resources within the next day.
Awesome. Ms. Jaqui, if we can, all of us, just a virtual round of applause, high five, thank yous in the chat for Ms. Jaqui for the last 3 months in her education that she's been able to provide to our community. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We've learned so much. We have so much more to learn. And the words I will take from you were to process beyond today. So the journey doesn't stop here, it continues. And I thank each and every one of you for joining us today to continue that journey. And we hope to have you back. And I will get Jackie's information out to everyone in a few days, along with those resources that she is gladly and graciously providing us. And we will see everyone soon. Thank you, Ms. Jaqui.
Thank you, Trish. Thank you for bringing me in. I feel like family. Invite me back anytime. All right.
Thank you very much, Jaqui.
Thank you, John.
Yeah.